I'm a search and rescue officer for the U.S. Forest Service. I have some stories to tell. I wasn't sure where else to post these stories, so I figured I'd share them here. I've been an SAR officer for a few years now, and along the way I've seen some things that I think you will be interested in. A few times, I've been out on my own searching with a canine, and they've tried to lead me straight up cliffs. Not hills, not even rock faces. Straight, sheer cliffs with no possible handholds. It's always baffling, and in those cases we usually find the person on the other side of the cliff, or miles away from where the canine has led us. I'm sure there's an explanation, but it's sort of strange. One particularly sad case involved the recovery of a body. A 9-year-old girl fell down an embankment and got impaled on a dead tree at the base. It was a complete freak accident, but I'll never forget the sound her mother made when we told her what had happened. She saw the body bag being loaded into the ambulance, and she let out the most haunting, heartbroken wail I've ever heard. It was like her whole life was crashing down around her, and a part of her had died with her daughter. I heard from another SAR officer that she killed herself a few weeks after it happened. She couldn't live with the loss of her daughter. I was teamed up with another SAR officer because we'd received reports of bears in the area. We were looking for a guy who hadn't come home from a climbing trip when he was supposed to, and we ended up having to do some serious climbing to get to where we figured he'd be. We found him trapped in a small crevasse with a broken leg. It was not pleasant. He'd been there for almost 2 days, and his leg was very obviously infected. We were able to get him into a chopper, and I heard from one of the EMTs that the guy was absolutely inconsolable. He kept talking about how he'd been doing fine, and when he'd gotten to the top, a man had been there. He said the guy had no climbing equipment, and he was wearing a parka and ski pants. He walked up to the guy, and when the guy turned around, he said he had no face. It was just blank. He freaked out and ended up trying to get off the mountain too fast, which is why he'd fallen. He said he could hear the guy all night, climbing down the mountain and letting out these horrible, muffled screams. That story bothered the hell out of me. I'm glad I wasn't there to hear it. One of the scariest things I've ever had happen to me involved the search for a young woman who'd gotten separated from her hiking group. We were out until late at night because the dogs had picked up her scent. When we found her, she was curled up under a large, rotted log. She was missing her shoes and pack, and she was clearly in shock. She didn't have any injuries, and we were able to get her to walk with us back to base ops. Along the way, she kept looking behind us and asking us why that big man with black eyes was following us. We couldn't see anyone, so we just wrote it off as some weird symptom of shock. But the closer we got to base, the more agitated this woman got. She kept asking me to tell him to stop making faces at her. At one point she stopped and turned around and started yelling into the forest, saying that she wanted him to leave her alone. She wasn't going to go with him, she said, and she wouldn't give us to him. We finally got her to keep moving, but we started hearing these weird noises coming from all around us. It was almost like coughing, but more rhythmic and deeper. It was almost insect-like. I don't really know how else to describe it. When we were within sight of base ops, the woman turns to me, and her eyes are about as wide as I can imagine a human could open them. She touches my shoulder and says he says to tell you to speed up. He doesn't like looking at the scar on your neck. I have a small scar on the base of my neck, but it's mostly hidden under my collar, and I have no idea how this woman saw it. Right after she says it, I hear that weird coughing right in my ear, and I just about jumped out of my skin. I hustled her to ops, trying not to show how freaked out I was, but I have to say I was really happy when we left the area that night. This is the last one I'll tell, and it's probably the weirdest story I have. Now, I don't know if this is true in every SAR unit, but in mine, it's sort of an unspoken, regular thing we run into. You can try asking about it with other SAR officers, but even if they know what you're talking about, they probably won't say anything about it. We've been told not to talk about it by our superiors, and at this point we've all gotten so used to it that it doesn't even seem weird anymore. On just about every case where we're really far into the wilderness, I'm talking 30 or 40 miles, at some point we'll find a staircase in the middle of the woods. It's almost like you took the stairs in your house, cut them out, and put them in the forest. I asked about it the first time I saw some, and the other officer just told me not to worry about it, that it was normal. Everyone I asked said the same thing. I wanted to go check them out, but I was told, very emphatically, that I should never go near any of them. I just sort of ignore them now when I run into them because it happens so frequently. I have a lot more stories, and I suppose if anyone's interested, I'll tell you some of them tomorrow. If anyone has any theories about the stairs, or if you've seen them too, let me know. I went camping at Crater Lake in Oregon, and where we camped it was heavily wooded and there were about 2 or 3 other people besides us. We get there around midday and we set up and relax. By now it is beginning to get dark, so we decide to cook some food and call it a day after we eat. Now me, my cousin, and my brother share a tent to sleep in, so I'd say around 2 to 3 a.m. rolls around and I have to pee. Anyways, I did my stuff and headed back to the tent to find the zipper wide open, and my little brother had gone. So, I start freaking out and I wake my cousin up to tell him what happened, and essentially we search until about sunrise and then we call the rangers. They search for about 4 to 5 hours, and they find him 10 miles away from our campsite, and he has no clue how he got there. All he has on is his underwear and nothing else. Now after this whole ordeal, our cousin tells us about David Paulides and his whole research on missing people in national parks. Needless to say, it was the most jarring and disturbing thing that has ever happened in my life. It really, in all honesty, ruined camping for all of us, and I loved camping too. But needless to say, Crater Lake is the place to go for some creepy paranormal. Not SAR or elite hiker by any means. But my 2 stories, and I will post the reveals because they're honestly mundane. A few years back, with a large group of scouts in Butano SP, we were hiking some godforsaken dense forest trail in the wet California winter rains. The first night, the raccoons rolled a bunch of our bear containers down a gully into a creek. We were able to find them. The second day, we encountered a road and a checkpoint. The guard booth was abandoned. There were no signs, but we concluded that it was an abandoned prison. We adults would have gone in there, but we didn't want to endanger the kids, so we hiked on. Later that night, right around 1 a.m., I was awakened by the sound of gunfire. It was about 100 plus yards away, and it was not a pistol. It was some very loud, sharp, poppy guns. Different guns. It started off slow, and then after a dozen or so, a pause, then more, then it was steady for maybe 100 plus or more, from several different guns. Then when the other gun stopped, the loudest one kept firing, and it wasn't full auto, but a lot of rapidly fired shots. Never got the count of the magazine between reloads, but this went on for about 20 minutes in total, then just stopped. I got out of my sleeping bag, out of my tent, and hiked about 30 yards through the brush to the other campsite, in the dark, without my light on. I didn't want anyone else to see me. I got to the campsite, and the kids were all still asleep, but the other adults had heard it, had no idea what it was. Maybe pot farmers in a gunfight with intruders? Next morning, it was a topic of conversation, but most of the kids had actually slept through it. After we left and got home, I talked to the ranger, and they said that sometimes, people break into the prison, and use the old gun range, unauthorized. My other story was camping in Big Sur, Silver Peak. I was alone, but only about 5 miles from the road. I had just finished dinner and lay down to sleep. After a few minutes, I heard kind of a crunch 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 sound, which sounded like footsteps outside. I moved my head to try to figure out what direction they were coming from, and they stopped. I put my head back down, and a few minutes later, they started again. Crunch 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 again. I lifted my head to see what direction they were coming from, or whether it was close. Nothing. This cycle repeated a couple of times until I decided to turn over and open my tent flap to get a look around outside with the flashlight. I was expecting to see a person out there, walking around in the dark, but I saw nothing. Heard nothing. Zipped up, put my head back down, tried to go back asleep. Again, crunch 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 crunch. Again, lifted my head, it stopped. I tried to readjust, I looked outside again, I couldn't find the source. It certainly wasn't my heart because that was thumping like mad. This kept me awake for hours that evening. I was terrified that there was someone or something out there who heard my move my head and stopped walking, only to continue when they thought I had fallen back asleep. Maybe past midnight, but eventually I fell asleep. Next morning, I had breakfast, broke camp, and as I set up my tent, I noticed that my head was over a gopher hole. Man, I have a bunch of these stories. I was in SAR as well, but all my creepy experiences have happened while camping or hiking. This one's pretty tame. I almost always camp way out. I'm talking 30 to 40 miles down unnamed dirt roads, up mountains, in canyons, etc. A couple of years ago I was camping alone out on a prairie flat, halfway surrounded by a forest. It's nearly winter and there's not a soul within 50 miles, I bet. My big hound dog was with me, as always. It was cold, like well below freezing, so I had a roaring campfire going. Jake the dog was in and out. He'd wander off for a while, get cold, and come back for attention and warmth. He has a bell around his collar so I can know where he is. I'm drinking beer and listening to music, so I'm not paying much attention to his whereabouts. Mind you, it's pitch black out there other than the stars. So, after about 20 minutes, I hadn't seen Jake, so I called him. Nothing. I turn off my music and call louder. Nothing for about 5 minutes. I heard his bell, so I'm relieved. I heard his bell behind me, which was odd. The tree line was in front of me, or he had been sniffing around earlier. Thinking he was nearby, I relaxed and refocused on chopping some more wood. I could faintly hear his bell jingling behind me still, sometimes closer, or further, and I figured he was doing the hound dog's job and smelling all around. I'd say about 40 minutes went by, and I hadn't heard his bell or seen him. So, I called him again, and get up to walk towards the tree line. A big dark forest of ponderosa pine looms in front of me. I shine my fairly bright flashlight around and into the trees. Nothing. No sound, no sight. I'm starting to get nervous, getting the willies or whatever you want to call it. I hear some crunches in the woods, like sticks and stuff breaking. Not knowing where my dog is, or much of anything other than okay, I'm going back to the fire where my shotgun is. I get back to my truck and my fire when I hear absolute panic barking from directly in front of me, from the tree line. Tearing across the field is my dog at full tilt. You could never mistake a hound dog's panic bark from a bay or a yip or whatever else. It's unlike anything. He ran behind me for a moment, and then underneath my truck. Here's the creepy part, no bell. He had his collar on, and the bell was clipped to it with a carabiner. Sure, I put us both in the cab of the truck for the rest of that frozen night. To this day I still have no clue who or what was wearing that bell behind me for a few hours on a rural prairie flat in winter. The scariest story I have is camping in northern Michigan with my dad. My grandma lived on a lake in a house near Gaylord, Michigan, which my parents and I would frequent every Friday through Sunday for well over a decade until my grandma sold the place. Our routine would be to pack up all necessary equipment for a 3-day camping trip and fit it into our rucks. Grab the mountain bikes and head off to one of the state forests. We then would find a random 2 tracks leading into the woods. Particularly we always aimed for those that look like they haven't been driven on in years due to overgrowth. Find a place to park, offload bikes and leave. General made our own trail when we could. Goal was to find a stream or river and set up camp in any clearing we could find. Usually ended up just in a clearing as we never went more than 10 to 15 miles from the truck. One time we actually came across an old foundation of an assuming was once a home. No trail or road remotely near for miles. Right on a stream. Made of rocks about the size of a brick. There was a small wooden shack maybe 10 feet or so from the foundation, maybe 4 or 4.5 feet tall. I remember my dad had to bend over and I just hunched, I was just a kid, to get inside. Inside were rusted out gun barrels galore. Fishing poles, snowshoes, bedding, old pots, and pans, etc. Clearly the area hadn't been used in a very long time. Just cool stuff for a 12-year-old kid. We set up camp about 20 feet away. Caught a few bullfrogs and cooked them up for dinner along with some pan-fried nachos on the small Coleman we had with those old-school mini propane tanks. No light pollution. The night sky was amazing. Could see so many stars. To this day my favorite part of camping is after dark. That night shortly before we went to bed, we tied up all of our food and hung it up about 15 feet or so in the air over a branch like you see in movies. Keep bears and other animals out of it essentially. Our normal nightly routine. Shortly after we zipped the tent up to get some sleep we started hearing grunting and huffing sounds coming from across the stream. Dad, being an avid hunter, says it's likely a deer or elk, maybe a bear. Which, we have seen all of these and more on our trips. Sound carries pretty far, so Dad wasn't too concerned. We heard it throughout the night, but the sound started getting almost baby-like. The only way I can describe it is imagining a baby whining softly. Add this with very deep huffs and grunting. Periodically we would bear a high-pitched, sharp but very short cry. Sounded to me like a baby screaming. Just creepy. Throughout the night these sounds come and go. Dad loaded the Remington, and I had my little 20-gauge small game ready to go just in case. My first gun and my first time taking it with us on one of our trips, we eventually fell asleep. We wake up to nothing too out of the ordinary except a stench of rotting meat, like a dead animal. We figured an animal died and we just could smell it on the wind. We would come across coyote kills sometimes or some other animals, so we didn't think anything of it. We go outside to a beautiful sunrise and the sound of flies. Dad just figures we lost the food, and the flies are on it now. Dad walks around back by the food bag and stops abruptly and just says, I still remember it, very slowly, a what? Is that? Behind our tent are 3 deer strung up, skinned and gutted. The deer were hung on 3 different branches on the same tree our bag was on, which was untouched. Each head was cut off and set on top of the guts. Each head was pointed directly at our tent. No one around. No footprints, no blood trail, nothing. Just 3 deer, hanging by vine. Not twine or rope, vines. Dad grabbed the gun and went to try and spot tracks or blood. He is a phenomenal tracker and has been a guide on a few occasions for experience hunts in the UP. He found nothing. We heard nothing in the night either. Creepy. I was incredibly spooked. Dad was too as we packed up that Saturday and headed back to the truck. No incidents on the way back. Just a normal half-day trip back the truck. Drove to DNR station and reported it. I just remember the guy looking at me, then my dad, shaking his head slowly and picking up the phone to call whoever, and all he said was something like another skinned animal sighting near the whatever steam. Clearly it happened before, but what? Dad never found out if it was someone or something. The fact that my dad couldn't find any blood spotting or trails where those deer would have been dragged or hoof prints where they perhaps walked is what to this day said baffles him the most. We still talk about it over a beer every now and then. He also doesn't know where the vines came from because he looked all around the area and there were no trees with any vines anywhere around. You may find it interesting to know that there is a man named Dave Paulides who investigates and documents cases exactly like the ones you describe, and he has accumulated a data set that contains hundreds of cases of strange wilderness disappearance from all over the world. These cases follow a specific pattern that involves circumstances which defy explanation/physics, and often involve a bear man creature, just like yours. In fact, I bet he would love to hear from you. He has written books on the subject, Missing 411 by Dave Paulides. Perhaps your stories could be investigated further and included in his next book? Most people just vanish completely. Finding someone alive after a strange disappearance like that is a rare thing for him, and you have 2 such cases, so I guarantee that Mr. Paulides would love to open files on them if at all possible. That is what he's up to these days. He's trying to find the underlying cause of this obvious pattern and being very thorough, but he says that there is absolutely no tracking system or database for these and finds resistance when he inquires through official channels. It's like the people at the top know about this, but don't want it to get out. There are cases that go back 100 years. It's been happening as long as we've been keeping track. When I was really young I had a dream I was walking in the woods. I wasn't lost, I was just in the woods for some reason walking forward. It was pretty dark, just enough to see if I focus on a single tree in front of me, when all of a sudden the forest starts to clear just a bit. It got a little brighter and there was a staircase in the middle of the woods. And just as you described it. Looked like a staircase right out of a house just in the middle of the woods. So now I'm pretty freaked out. If you get any more info about the staircase I'd really appreciate it. Oh man. The staircases. Across the street from the farm we used to live on in Oregon, there was a huge, abandoned plot of forest. It was probably 50 acres or so. It belonged to a widow who lived elsewhere, according to the older families in the area. She and her husband had planned to build a house on it after raising the forest, but he died before the plans took root. We used to ride our horses through the woods on dry days, and we always passed by this staircase that leaned up on a tree a few miles in. There was never a house built there according to neighbors. The forest was too dense and old anyway. It always gave me the creeps, and we jokingly called it the stairway to heaven to alleviate the tension when we rode by it. The horses weren't fans either. They got particularly spooky and snorty when we went to pass it. I'd always wondered what it was doing there. I've seen these trails. I worked for the underpaid grunt work forest-wide job, and we ended up closing up some illegal trails in Annandale State Park. That place isn't too big, but those trails, unmarked and unmapped, will take you to all sorts of places. One day we were walking along, seeing weird shrines and smiley faces carved into these young, dense pines. The trail was getting steeper and thinner the further we went, and every now and then we'd see another trail crossing our path. Our crew leader just had us briss it up and wouldn't let us explore them like usual. Said we were too far in, and that he had a funny feeling. We all did, but we kept going, 'cause the day was still young. Eventually we rounded a corner and saw them, just a set of 5 steps in the middle of the wood. We looked around, saw that there was no good reason to have a set of steps there, and gave the nod to our axeman. He hopped up with his axe and destroyed it. Completely. We got out of there fine, though. Still felt funny about it the next day, but it's almost like a dream, now. God. I may have taken 6 whole years to find this thing. I'm old, leave me alone, but this stuff is creepy as all hell. I'm sorry you had to experience that. It's weird you mention all this, though. I worked in a rural town, down in Australia, still live here. We've seen a lot of weird stuff out here. A lot of horrible stuff too. I was considering writing a book about our going-ons once I retired from the police force. Well, as I write, I am retired, and getting older and more forgetful every day. Maybe I should write about some of my community's experiences here one day? All credit to you, of course. This is terrifying stuff. I've seen a couple other posts about different areas with similar experiences. Reckon I'll hop on the Forest Terror wagon myself, share what I've seen. Why not, anyway? I'll tell you that I lived in a very rural area growing up. There was a mountain and plenty of woods around us. We had neighbors and all that, but they were far enough away that you could just see their houses. We had a pit bull named Buster out in the back who had a nice doghouse and plenty of room to run around and play. There was a nice fence in the area where he couldn't just run off. One night I awoke to this loud screaming. I swear it sounded like a woman almost. It was terrifying and sounded like something painful was happening to whatever was making that sound. In panic I thought about Buster and grabbed a .357 Magnum that my father gave me for my 18th birthday. Without getting dressed I ran to the kitchen to get to the back door so I could check it out. Fortunately, my father was awake and had his shotgun and a big spotlight. We could hear rustling way out back and more of that screaming. We started running towards the noise only to spot Buster face up against the fence and screaming in angry, "I'm gonna kill you" type of bark that a dog only does when they feel threatened or if they've been attacked. We could hear what sounded like limping for a bit and then it stopped. Buster calmed down after a few minutes and we were scanning the tree line like crazy. Finally, Buster walked away and went to his bed. We decided to let him go into the house that night. It was a nice summer night, but we didn't want to wake up again in case anything happened. When I got Buster to my bedroom, his inside dog bed was laid out at the foot of my bed. He went to lay down and I went back to sleep. The next morning, I woke up and looked at him and found that he had scratch marks all over his body. 2 puncture wounds on his back left thigh as well. I rushed him to the vet, and he was given antibiotics and some other medication. I went to where he was and found a blood trail. Turns out he got into a scuffle with a big wildcat. Found it dead about 50 to 60 yards away from the fence. It lost too much blood and died. Not scary or interesting I guess, but it freaked me out that night. Holy Mother of Jesus, I've heard the cough before, back when I was doing survival training in the army. I was alone in the woods of Canada with nothing but a ration kit and a knife. They even took our belts so we couldn't hang ourselves if we lost it. We did this as a unit, but we were each at least 5 miles apart. Late one night I was having some serious trouble sleeping, my shelter was rustling but there was no wind, that's when the coughs began. I was freaking out trying to dismiss it as one of my platoon mates hunting in the woods or something, even though we were explicitly told to stay within visual range of our shelter. I decide to investigate the sound and look toward the entangled door of my shelter, a barefoot with frayed jeans at the ankle. After reading the Black-Eyed Man story 20 minutes ago I still have chills running down my spine. I guess I know what the creature that stole kids was. Here in Russia/Ukraine people calls him, he is something like the demon who lives in the woods. He often stole kids, or messing with people who lost in woods. He is not kind, even more, he's very unfriendly to people. For example, he often make people lost, he can change forest's landscape, he can create haze and stuff like that. Most likely if you meet him out there in the woods, you have all of the chances to disappear completely, like those people from stories. Back then, when old Russian Empire, not USSR/ or Russian Federation, wasn't yet into religion of Jesus Christ, people were really close to nature and they could easily fight such creatures with rituals, or if they were in trouble they just started to pray to gods of forest, so they're protected people from such creatures. But nowadays it's all gone and probably if you will be unlucky enough to meet such creature today, you are dead men, so be careful next time when you'll be in the woods. I found a staircase similar to the ones you've mentioned. I've told this story many times so please forgive the well-worn rhetoric. I found the staircase while walking through foliage so thick I didn't see it until it was almost underfoot. The stairs were made of loose cobble and moist earth like they were a work of masonry once, long ago. They were dusted with shards of worn glass and shreds of burnt parchment. At the base I found a rusted tin medallion no larger than a coin resting on the moss. Now I couldn't have been too far from civilization, but in that moment I felt like I was the only human on earth, standing there wrapped in walls of leaves and branches. I climbed the stairs thoughtlessly, effortlessly, half expecting there to be a landing to greet me at the top. There wasn't though. Just another crumbly step and an unimpressive view. I could see the red tin roof of the DPW yard I cut through to get here, and beyond it glistening smokestacks reached up towards the clouds, spilling white smoke into the clear blue sky. Each stack topped by a hazy red light blinking lazily, beckoning me back to reality. To my right the tall, thick brambles bled into cattails that stretched all the way to a distant tree line. Something caught my eye as I craned my head. The bushes were packed tight except where the stumps of long dead trees formed sunken wells around them, and from one of the craters someone was looking at me, their gaze fixed. I remember clearly their dark, lean face, their round eyes black like the eyes of a doll flashing in the sun. No sooner had I seen the face than it disappeared again, only then did I have the foresight to take off down the steps and back through the bushes and brambles towards the buildings I could no longer see. It's a different world in the bushes, a claustrophobic world of sharp sticks and thin corridors, a blur of green and black that blots out the sun. Thankfully I was younger then, my feet carried me over the marshy ground and delivered me to freedom, delivered me to the chain link fence that drew the line between realities and the hole I'd cut that blurred it. It was on that day I swore never to visit Detroit again. So, I joined Reddit just so I could post this comment. And read more no-sleep stories of course, but still. Anyway, I used to work at a lot of conventions when I was about 20. I lived in the Delaware Valley. My manager lived in upstate PA and there were a lot of cars, trucks and hunting shows that way that his agency would book shows for us. Anyway, my parents were out of town, and I was watching their dog, Blue. He was an 80 pounds English Shepherd and an alpha. He didn't respect me much, but he would have died protecting me because he knew I was pack. Anyway, there was a show that weekend and I usually stayed at my manager's house in his guest house for the weekend shows. I had to take my dog W since I was watching him. I got there the Friday before the convention and took my dog for a walk down the road. It was dusk and gorgeous and way more wooded and secluded than my hometown, so I was enjoying it. We walked a fair way down the road and then I decided to take him off the path and into a little clearing I could vaguely see through the trees. So, we went into this clearing and there is lots of tall grass and it is dusk, so visibility is low. He is sniffing around and generally enjoying himself and then at the same time we both notice the grass on the opposite side of the clearing moving, probably 200 to 300 feet away. He immediately stiffens and lets out this visceral growl that I have never heard him make before. Not just that someone is at the door growl, but our lives are in immediate danger, and I will attack and kill if need be growl. So, I started getting nervous and back up a bit. I'm thinking from the size of the movement, the grass was a little over waist high, that it's maybe a cougar or wolf or whatever my imagination is scaring me with. In retrospect, I wish it were a cougar or wolf. Anyway, I am trying to get Blue out of the clearing and back to the road, but he is frozen stiff and not budging. He is in full flight or fight mode, and he's obviously chosen the latter. The thing is moving around, kind of foraging and what seems to be looking for food. While it's moving back and forth, I catch a glimpse of it really fast through a sparse area of grass, and it looks seriously like one of the werewolves from TV. It was mostly naked with a ridge of fur down its back, and its face kind of looked like a hyena. In all honesty, it could have been a huge dog or wolf with mange. But its legs were all wrong. Most canine-like animals walk on their toes, with the first bend in their legs being their ankle. The second bend is their knee, and their hips aren't visible the way ours are. So, their legs look like this, poor rendering, I know. Anyway, this thing's legs were backwards. Its feet pointed backwards and the first bend in its leg pointed forwards. The second, that should have been its knee, pointed backwards. Like this, so, I dragged my dog by the scruff of his neck and jogged home at a brisk pace. It never noticed we were there. My only logical explanation was that maybe it was a large dog or wolf with a mange and a severe genetic defect. But I have done a lot of work in dog rescue, and I've never seen a defect like that. That being said, it might exist, but any kind of defect I've ever seen of that magnitude has rendered the dog immobile. This thing was walking and trotting like nobody's business. Still don't know WTF that thing was, and would prefer there to be a logical explanation, but I haven't really found one. I've got two stories from my childhood that sound remarkably similar to this. Both occurred within a block of my childhood home while I was sleeping over at a friend's place. I tend to be the last one awake at get-togethers, to this day, and at times it seems this affords me the opportunity to see strange things. The first story happened when I was near 9 or so. My friend's room was on the second floor, and looking out his window at night gave a view of the lone streetlight on this street. It was after midnight, my friend was asleep, when all of a sudden I heard screaming. Not shouting, but blood-curdling screams. I peered out the window, and standing in the middle of the streetlight's light was a shadow figure. It looked like a tall man, but bulky on top, and the shape was off. It moved like it was struggling to escape from a straitjacket, feet planted, but its upper half wrestling with itself. I turned to look at my friend, to see if he had woken up, but no. As soon as I looked back, it was gone. No more sounds or anything, but I couldn't shake the feeling that somehow it had noticed me watching it. The second story happened a few years later. Another sleepover at a different friend's house, but this time we stayed in tents in his backyard. Being about 12 to 13 now, of course the tents made it easy for us to sneak out late and be hooligans. Well, this backyard had one hitch, a tall wooden privacy fence closed in the whole backyard, and with a loud gate right outside his parents' room, we had to hop the fence to escape. We had done this before, but on this night, one of the other kids said to them, "Just don't feel right about it tonight." Naturally, the rest of us made fun of him and decided that we would go anyway. As we peek over the fence to make sure the coast is clear, an animal goes running past at full speed. It took a second to sink in, but we all looked at each other and decided to stay in that night. Discussing what we just saw, we all agreed that at first glance it looked like a big dog, but not quite. Its forelimbs were big and bulky, almost more like a gorilla than a dog, and its head was the wrong shape, almost like a small human head. And the way it ran was nothing like a dog, again almost ape-like. Then of course, it ran at top speed, not like it was being chased, but more like it was doing the chasing. Spooked us all to the point that we never stayed at his place again, inside or out. I've got two stories from my childhood that sound remarkably similar to this. Both occurred within a block of my childhood home while I was sleeping over at a friend's place. I tend to be the last one awake at get-togethers, to this day, and at times it seems this affords me the opportunity to see strange things. The first story happened when I was near 9 or so. My friend's room was on the second floor, and looking out his window at night gave a view of the lone streetlight on this street. It was after midnight, my friend was asleep, when all of a sudden I heard screaming. Not shouting, but blood-curdling screams. I peered out the window, and standing in the middle of the streetlight's light was a shadow figure. It looked like a tall man, but bulky on top, and the shape was off. It moved like it was struggling to escape from a straitjacket, feet planted, but its upper half wrestling with itself. I turned to look at my friend, to see if he had woken up, but no. As soon as I looked back, it was gone. No more sounds or anything, but I couldn't shake the feeling that somehow it had noticed me watching it. The second story happened a few years later. Another sleepover at a different friend's house, but this time we stayed in tents in his backyard. Being about 12 to 13 now, of course the tents made it easy for us to sneak out late and be hooligans. Well, this backyard had one hitch, a tall wooden privacy fence closed in the whole backyard, and with a loud gate right outside his parents' room, we had to hop the fence to escape. We had done this before, but on this night, one of the other kids said to them, "Just don't feel right about it tonight." Naturally, the rest of us made fun of him and decided that we would go anyway. As we peek over the fence to make sure the coast is clear, an animal goes running past at full speed. It took a second to sink in, but we all looked at each other and decided to stay in that night. Discussing what we just saw, we all agreed that at first glance it looked like a big dog, but not quite. Its forelimbs were big and bulky, almost more like a gorilla than a dog, and its head was the wrong shape, almost like a small human head. And the way it ran was nothing like a dog, again almost ape-like. Then of course, it ran at top speed, not like it was being chased, but more like it was doing the chasing. Spooked us all to the point that we never stayed at his place again, inside, or out. Speaking of strange wilderness occurrences, my first camping trip was when I was about 8 or 9 years old. One of my mom's friends invited us to stay at her family's sort of mini cabins. They were like one-room cabins that each had 2 twin beds in them and an end table in between. I don't remember much of the trip very vividly, but I do distinctly remember walking with my dad and brother through the woods to meet up with my mom and the other campers. I kept getting scared/panicky and wanting to go faster because every tree and log I looked at seemed to have reptilian eyes peering out of knotholes. One in particular looked exactly like an alligator with gray-brown skin, think ash tree, and I swear I even saw it blink. When I freaked out and told my dad and brother, they said I was being silly, and it was just a dead/hollow log. I looked back, and it was indeed just an empty log with a hole in the side. This might have just been me terrified of alligators and snakes and things, or having been too affected by that one scene in Snow White where she runs through the woods and sees eyes everywhere, or a combination of the two, but I swear I wasn't just imagining the eyes. The log was more of a first-glance sort of mistake, especially because I was already on edge, but I kept seeing the eyes in literally every knothole before they disappeared when I look back. While I have a vivid imagination, I never hallucinate things, and by that I mean I never actually see things that aren't there. Even my imaginary friends were always strictly invisible, so if I ever saw something I was very sure it was real. Ever since then I've just been very uneasy about the wilderness. I have a story that is unexplainable by me and my friends that sounds unbelievable. When looking back at it, we don't know what to make of it. This isn't a scary story, but it's just straight weird. My 3 friends and I ventured out into the woods by my house at about 1 in the morning. We've done this on multiple occasions, but when we go out, we travel in camo and packs. At the time we're about 16 years old. But as we went out, we found this fence and so we decided to crawl underneath it. This required us to use a shovel to be able to fit underneath it. When we were looking at the dirt, we found this glowing white substance. I don't really know how to describe it, but it was like several small glowing specks. This seemed unusual to us, but my 2 other friends claimed to have seen this before on previous adventures in the woods. We continued forward through the woods and all of us started to get this very freaky feeling. It was a full moon out but the woods that were in front of us were completely pitch black and full of thick brush, so we decided to go back since we didn't want to risk anything. We began to hear some things move in the brush. Literally as we decided to go back, I swear, we saw this beam of light come up from the woods and into the sky. I don't know what it was, but it was about 100 feet away from us. After seeing this we left the woods. To this day we can't explain how it happened, but all of us saw it with our individual eyes. I live in northern Utah and there are countless stories, legends, and myths about the surrounding mountain areas. I have experienced a lot of things in the woods while camping and enjoy nature, and the one that always stands out for me, and I experienced, is Old Man Herzog. We were on an overnight scout trip up Green Canyon, just above North Logan. There were around 10 of us and 2 leaders. We were up at the highest campground at the end of the dirt road, right next to the fence for the wilderness area / Tony Grove Trail. We set up camp, talked and enjoyed each other's company. One of our leaders decided to tell us a story that he was told by his dad about an old man from our town who went missing many years ago and was last seen walking up into the hills above the town, towards the forest. He said his name was Herzog. He said that he is seen often during the summer months. We all thought that he was just trying to scare us, and we laughed it off. When it started to get dark, we decided to play Steal the Flag. So, we split off into teams and started to play. About an hour into the game, my friends Brett, Bill, and I were hiding in a big bush in between some trees. I was looking around when I noticed a flash of white coming down the hillside. I kept watching and could pinpoint where it was going to emerge from the forest, and out stepped an old man. At first I was shocked, and then I told my friends to look, and they both saw him as well. He was walking towards our direction, and we were dead quiet. I knew he could not see us. We were well hidden, but he walked up to the bush and said, "Nice night for a game, huh guys," and then kept walking until he headed up the other mountain on the other side of the meadow we were playing in. No one else saw him, except us. Now I know that area well, and from where he came, his age, and without any flashlight there is no way he could have navigated that steep mountain slope. He came and then was gone. Still get a creepy feeling in that area of Green Canyon. I'm also a fan of David Paulide's Missing 411 Stories. There has to be something coming from above. In so many cases, there are no footprints or tracks of any kind. Dogs lose the scent. People just disappear in the blink of an eye. People, especially kids, are found ridiculous distances away from where they go missing. Sometimes these are toddlers who could not possibly cover that amount of ground even if it were flat. Climbing a tree and never coming down. And people are found at higher ground, sometimes up or over sheer cliffs they could not possibly scale. They are found in the middle of ponds with no footprints on the edge. Some appear to have fallen from a great height. They are found in places that multiple search teams covered. For small children, it would seem plausible they were carried away by eagles or other large birds of prey. I don't think there are many stories like that coming from survivors, though. If they remember anything and are able to communicate, they talk of being lured somehow. The stories seem idiosyncratic. Some see relatives or strange people, some see odd animals. The stairs are definitely creepy, and I'd never heard of them before. I kind of wonder whether strange stuff would happen if people purposely built stairs in the middle of nowhere, like, if you build it, they will come. Anyway, these are great stories. I haven't found any full flights of stairs, but when I was in elementary school in Ohio there was a section of field and a section of forest by a large blacktop that we used for recess, and during recess we were allowed to go out in the field and explore the edge of the forest. In the edge of the forest some older kids found what looked like part of a sidewalk curb, and they decided to dig it out because it was just beneath a layer of dirt, no plants growing. They just kind of pushed the dirt out of the way, and there were these huge stone blocks that formed steps. This took a few days, or a week, of course. They only ended up pushing enough dirt to find 3 steps before the school realized they were terraforming a bit much and told them to stop. I went to a summer camp outside of Pioneer, Ohio, in the middle of the woods. It is split on the border of Michigan and Ohio, and I woke up one night from something or someone outside my tent and I had to pee, so I did. I heard what I'd think were animals, and it was a clear night out, so I was looking up in the sky and I saw a figure in a tall tree, the tallest in the area. It stared back at me with glowing eyes. There was no moon that night. I ran back into my tent and tried to fall back asleep, but all I heard were whispers outside my tent. Then one of our snack boxes, we put food in wooden boxes with locks on them, so raccoons don't get in them, got knocked over and woke everyone up in the area. There were not any raccoons that big to knock down our snack boxes. I looked at the tree before I went back in my tent, and I swear the figure in the tree jumped up out of the tree, and it was the shape of a human. It landed in the woods somewhere, and I never go back to that camp before even my friends say that they see figures in the trees there. About the ladders, I wanted to share my thoughts about it. Although it might start weird, please hear me out, smiley face. Among XTC users, hallucinations are common, and the things they hallucinate are often similar. For us users, for lack of a better term, it is common knowledge that, when on XTC or MDMA, one might suddenly find everyone around him wearing glasses. Or one might see a clean table, or an unoccupied sofa, in the middle of the club, or forest. Aztec architecture symbols, tables, sofas, and glasses are the most common hallucinations. Let's go to the sofa over there. Dude, what sofa? There's no sofa here, we're in a forest. Wait, why you serious? Yeah, you are tripping, bro. Aw, must be the XTC. To emphasize how similar the experiences are, the first time I had the glasses thing, I shouted something like LOL, I have the glasses thing. And everyone knew what I meant. The heaviest hallucinatory experience I've had in this regard was me exiting my house, looking over the street, and seeing the same CR parked all along the street. What happened here was my brain not registering the details of the cars in the street. It registered one car and copy-pasted it over the other cars. It refused to spend extra energy on the details of those cars. In other words, I hallucinated because my brain was too tired, or too busy doing other things, to spend energy on the details of the cars. My brain wasn't wrong, it was compensating. You are seeing the ladders might be, you are being very euphoric. Your brain being tired from overactivity. Or both. One can imagine that while doing hard work in the forest, a place with a lot of stimuli, one's senses may be influenced in non-traditional ways, which might result in seeing particular items. Like me and my fellow XTC users, your colleagues hallucinate the same objects. Our objects fall under the category of comfortable/pleasant social objects. Your object, a ladder, falls under mobility and overview. Just my 2 cents. Weird how something I thought was irrelevant turns out to be out there. I lived in a small town surrounded by rivers and lakes. Let me say my town is in the middle of nowhere. Me and my family would go fishing every now and then. One day I went fishing with a close cousin at the time, and his father wanted to show us something after we finished fishing. We went along the rivers not knowing what he wanted to show us. It was quite far out, I'd say maybe 30 kilometers out of town. Next thing you know, out of nowhere we saw a random perfectly carved staircase on an island right by the shore. It was about 4 steps. He told us not to go near it, not to take pictures, or tell anyone, so we didn't. He told us this legend of the rock people in which they use the stairs for fishing, Native American descent. I was full of questions, so I asked how long it was there. He said it was always there, since our ancestors. At that age I was very skeptical about everything, so I thought it was nothing. Now it's just making my head spin, wondering why they are out there so far and why everyone keeps it on the down low. Not only that, if it were there since our ancestors, what could create that 200 years ago? Always more questions than answers. I don't normally read/no sleep stories because they are generally too long, and while I don't like scary things, I saw your story and said, hey, not too long, and I like survivalist things. Well, hell, the stairs thing really got to me. I will never go into the woods that deep, ever.
Thanks for watching. Please comment, like, share and subscribe. The Internet Surfer on YouTube for more horror and scary stories.